Well, good Saturday evening. I'm meteorologist Evan Stewart here from WVEC in Norfolk, Virginia. Welcome to Hurricane Hub Live. This is a special broadcast, a special production that we do here at 13 News Now. We do it every weekday at 8 o'clock in the evening, and when we have something to talk about, which we certainly do, we have special editions on the weekends. Now, this is something that we do specifically for 13 News Now Plus, but I know we have viewers from all across the country who are watching on your station's Plus app. So welcome to Hurricane Hub Live, and we have a lot to talk about because we have a major hurricane that is still brewing near the island of Puerto Rico. So let's get right to it. Talk about what's going on in the tropics. And of course, we are talking about Hurricane Erin, which became the first hurricane of this hurricane season yesterday morning at 11 o'clock and rapidly intensified, became a Category 5 hurricane earlier this morning. Now, we have seen a little bit of weakening. I'll talk about why we're seeing that here, but you might even be able to see that here on the satellite view. This is the last 12 hours of Erin. Just to give you a sort of an idea, here's Hispaniola, the Dominican Republic and Haiti, Turks and Caicos. Here's Cuba, southern tip of Florida. This is the island of Puerto Rico. You can see San Juan popping up there on the map. We got the U.S. and British Virgin Islands and the Windward and Leeward Islands here, the Lesser Antilles. You'll notice we had a pretty well-defined eye a little bit earlier this afternoon, and now we're not seeing that eye. We'll zoom in here a little bit closer, and it's a pinhole of an eye, only about 6 miles across, but it shows up well on the infrared satellite, and then it starts to disappear. What's going on? Well, we're undergoing what we call an eyewall replacement cycle inside of Hurricane Erin. What does that mean? When hurricanes get very, very large, they almost collapse in on themselves a little bit as they try to reform. And the Hurricane Hunter aircraft that were in there earlier were saying there were concentric eyewalls, meaning there were 2 of them. And what happens is that inner eyewall starts to tighten up and collapse, and that outer eyewall starts to take over. This is a normal process that intense hurricanes undergo, and that's what we're seeing with Erin right now. And again, we have that well-defined eye. This is sort of a color-enhanced version of the infrared satellite. Gives us a little bit of a better idea when all the colors are white. It's hard to sometimes discern what's going on, but this is a measure of the color of the temperature of the cloud tops as registered by the satellite. And once we get into those bright white colors, those are the coldest cloud tops, the tallest of the thunderstorms that are encapsulating the storm. And maybe a little bit of dry air has been trying to be pulled into it just a little bit as well. And there is a little bit of dry air ahead of it. But these fluctuations in intensity are not uncommon, especially again when we're talking about major hurricanes 3, 4, and 5, which of course we had a Category 5 hurricane a little bit earlier today. As of the 8 o'clock advisory has been reduced to a Category 4, again, because of that eyewall replacement cycle. It's just a normal process that happens with hurricanes, and that's what we're seeing with this one right now. And you can see where these bright white bands are, these outer bands now bringing some soaking rain to Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. And we already have flood advisories and flood watches up for the island of Puerto Rico because of those outer rain bands. Now, Erin is a fairly small storm across its diameter. That will change as the storm starts to make that eventual turn to the north that we've been forecasting here for the past several days. Now, Hurricane Hunter aircraft are back flying into Erin right now, and you might recognize that they do this crisscross pattern. They'll make several passes through that eye wall, through the center of the storm, trying to find where the lowest pressure is, where the strongest winds are. Sometimes that's on the north side of the eye. Sometimes it's in some of these outer bands of the storm. But right now, it looks like that the Hurricane Hunter aircraft making that pass through, and that information that they deliver will be fed into the computer models. Of course, this is also what provides us the latest advisories that come in from the National Hurricane Center, and this will, of course, update with the 11 o'clock advisory as well. The 8 o'clock is an intermediate advisory. We'll talk about what that means here in just a moment as well. But that's the Hurricane Hunter aircraft, again, out there surveying the storm. This is a look at the radar, and this is land-based radar. So we have, radars through the, Lesser Antilles, through the Virgin Islands, into Puerto Rico. So we don't have radar out over the open water. So there is a lot more going on here on the north side of the storm. Just the land-based radars can't see that far, especially when they have to push through a lot of that heavy rain. But there you can see the eye of the storm, generally moving off towards the west. There was a little bit of a northwest jog a little bit earlier this afternoon. I'll kind of hold my hand steady there, and you can see how there was that little northwest jog that we had. And eventually we do expect more of a west-northwest movement and a turn off towards the north. But you can see, again, that heavy rain moving through the U.S. and British Virgin Islands and over here towards Puerto Rico, and already seeing some of that rain move into Hispaniola, and the eastern half of the island is, of course, the Dominican Republic. The western half is Haiti. So that's the latest now, and I want to talk about that wind history because, again, we saw that rapid development. You can see, we had nothing out there really Thursday. By Friday, we had a tropical depression, and then by Sunday, we started to see everything start to increase, and then notice that while we had a tropical storm through Wednesday into Thursday, and then rapidly we went from a tropical storm all the way up to a Category 5 hurricane. We had winds increase of 85 miles per hour just in the span of 24 hours. And that just blows the definition of rapid intensification out of the water. The official definition is at least a 35 mile per hour wind increase in 24 hours. We saw 85, so almost triple of what you would expect with rapid intensification by the classical definition. Now, one fact to know is that 1 in 3 storms undergo rapid intensification, and most Category 4 and 5 see that rapid intensification because all the ingredients are there. And Erin really was in a sweet spot in the Atlantic Ocean. We saw low wind shear at very, very warm waters, and that allowed it, again, to rapidly intensify. So this is the 8 o'clock advisory just in from the National Hurricane Center, winds of 150 miles per hour to 150 miles right now northeast of San Juan, moving west at 15. That hasn't changed, but the pressure has come up. That, again, is likely because of that Eyewall replacement cycle. And we expect some of these fluctuations in the wind speed when we see those Eyewall replacement cycles. It's very hard for these hurricanes, once they get this strong, to maintain that for any length of time. So some slight fluctuations are likely here as we go through the overnight. But again, this is still a 150 mile per hour hurricane. 157 takes us to Category 5. So again, it has weakened just a little bit. There's not a lot of difference between 150 mile per hour winds and 160, the damage that they can do. So it's more academic that it's now a Category 4. But again, this is still a major hurricane. And the good news is that the center of the storm is remaining offshore of Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, and is likely to remain offshore the Turks and Caicos. Now, we do have some hurricane watches, or tropical storm watches, up for the Turks and Caicos, because they will be on the outer edge of the storm. And as the storm moves off towards the northwest, we will start to see some gradual weakening. So here's the official forecast from the Hurricane Center. Now, this is based on the 5 o'clock advisory. We get new cones every 6 hours at 5 o'clock and 11 o'clock a.m. and p.m. And then we get these intermediate advisories when storms are close to land. So some fluctuations in wind speed coming up here through the overnight and into Sunday and Monday. But we are expecting a turn off towards the north, keeping it well east of the U.S. coastline. And this right here, that's the island of Bermuda. It's a little hard to see, but that little dot right there is the island of Bermuda. So the official forecast, the center, keeps it west of Bermuda. Let's talk about the cone a little bit, because the cone of uncertainty doesn't just show, where the impacts of the storm will be. The storm is larger than the actual diameter of the cone. You can see that the cone here, is very, very small, very, very narrow. And this is just a forecast of where the center of the storm will go. That's that center line in there. But there's uncertainty, there's error in forecasting, and a small difference at the beginning becomes a greater error the farther out you go. So this is sort of that margin of error, that uncertainty that is built into a hurricane forecast. So the storm could be on the western edge of the cone, could be on the eastern edge of the cone, and this cone is shifted westward just a little bit based on some of the latest computer model guidance coming in. Again, still keeps it east of the U.S. coastline, but this is going to be a large storm, and it's going to grow in size, maybe not in strength. You can see it goes from a Category 4 to a 3, still a major hurricane off the east coast of the United States, those winds diminishing as it moves off towards the north. But a lot of times with weakening storms, especially ones moving into the northern latitudes, the wind field starts to expand. So what is right now a very, very powerful compact hurricane as it ever so slowly weakens, it's going to grow in size. And it has the potential to double, maybe even triple in size, and that'll spread those winds out. And potentially, we could see tropical storm winds here across the eastern seaboard, especially down through coastal North Carolina. Of course, you know, those who are here in eastern Virginia, North Carolina, are very familiar with the Outer Banks. I know a lot of folks watching across the country have heard of the Outer Banks, and it sort of juts out there off towards the east. So it's sort of like, you know, areas of the Outer Banks, and once you get up towards Cape Cod, up towards the northeast, since they sort of jut out, they feel the effects of the storms a little bit more than right near, you know, especially as you get in here to the curved coastline of Georgia and South Carolina, and sort of that same little bump inland or a bump inward up around New York and New Jersey. Even with a massive hurricane off the coast, those swells are going to be big. There are going to be big waves around the center of this storm. It was a Category 5. It's likely going to regain that Category 5 strength as it undergoes this Eyewall replacement cycle. Even if it doesn't, still a major Category 4 hurricane that's going to be pushing a lot of water. And those waves could be upwards of 50 feet near the center of the storm. And those waves will propagate outward. And as they head towards the coastline, that is really going to increase the threat of rip currents up and down the eastern seaboard, likely even starting as early as Monday. Wouldn't be surprised if we see red flags flying at a lot of the coastal beaches from Florida all the way up towards New England, certainly as we go through the middle part of the week, as the storm passes by Wednesday into Thursday, when we'll see some of the biggest impacts right along the immediate coastline here of Virginia and North Carolina, and eventually up towards New Jersey and New York and out towards the Cape. So this is the official forecast path and the forecast track of Hurricane Erin. So now we're going to take a look at some of the computer model forecast for Erin. And you may have heard your local meteorologist, you've heard me and the rest of us here at 13 News Now talk about two major computer models. We talk about the American, the GFS, and the European, the ECMWF. And those are the two primary forecast models that we use for long-range forecasting. So we have a number that do short-range forecasts, but it's the American and the European that give us the long-range forecasts. And then we have something known as ensembles. So this is what happens. We run the American and the European models, or the governments do, so to speak. And then we decide, well, maybe, you know, since the models run, you know, only 4 times a day, you know, the initial conditions change. We've seen that fluctuation in the strength of Erin. So we go into the model and we say, all right, initially we said it had 160 mile per hour winds. Maybe it's undergoing an Eyewall replacement cycle. We'll bump it down a little bit, or maybe it's a little farther to the north or the south, and we run that model again. Sometimes we'll run it 20 or 30 different times. And when you make those little changes in the beginning, as I talked about, that margin of error, also little changes or tweaks in the initial conditions can make big changes in the long-range forecast. So that's what we're going to put on here. These are the ensemble models. In the red, we have the European, and in the yellow, we have the American. So we've run these models 20, 30 different times with just some little tweaks in those initial conditions, and they give us different outputs. And the one thing that you will notice again, and I mentioned it earlier, there has been a little bit of a shift towards the west, especially the European model has shifted a little bit towards the west. The good news, all members of the ensemble, as we like to say, still keep the center of the storm offshore. There are a couple outliers here that bring it certainly closer to coastal North Carolina. The vast majority, the consensus here, still well off the coastline and west of the island of Bermuda. Again, there has been a little bit of that shift towards the west with the latest run of the European, and likewise, the ensemble models have shifted just a little bit towards the west as well. So I wouldn't be surprised if there maybe isn't a further adjustment in the actual cone as we get that 11 o'clock advisory in from the Hurricane Center. Still expecting the storm to remain offshore of the U.S. East Coast. Can't totally write it off. Have to wait and see what happens. Wait for that turn. That's really the key on Monday when we see that turn off towards the north. But again, right now, all the models, the consensus keeps the storm offshore. So why do we think that's going to happen? So let's talk about the steering currents and what's going on in the upper atmosphere. So as hurricanes get stronger, especially as we get into Category 4 and 5, and I made this graphic just before we got that 8 o'clock update, so officially it's a 4. But the taller and stronger a hurricane is, the more it's influenced by some of the upper level winds. A weak hurricane isn't very tall, and the steering currents are more of the surface winds. But as you get a larger and larger hurricane, it becomes more influenced by the upper level winds. And one way to think about it is hurricanes, they don't decide where they go. They don't have their own steering. It's the steering currents from weather systems that are around it. Have a big high pressure that is out into the central Atlantic. Again, there's the island of Bermuda. Sometimes we call it the Bermuda High. You might have heard that term before. And we have a big area of high pressure out here in the central portions of the U.S. Have a little bit of a dip in here. We have one low that's moving through the North Atlantic. And we have a little bit of a weakness in what we call the ridge here. So that's what the high pressure is giving us, a ridge that sort of acts like a block. Think of it as mountains. If you have a big mountain here and a big mountain here, a ridge line, so to speak, and we have a little bit of a gap, a little bit of a valley showing up here in the ridge. And that's sort of the escape path for Erin. If this ridge was a lot stronger, maybe a little bit farther to the west, then that would push Erin closer to the coastline. If this ridge was a lot stronger and was a little bit farther to the east, it would push Erin quickly out into the Atlantic Ocean. Fortunately for us, as far as it looks right now, based on all the forecast models, the ridge is not terribly strong. This one's strong enough. And we have a cold front that's going to push through on Monday here through the eastern seaboard. That's also going to help break that ridge just a little bit. And this ridge isn't quite as strong as it could be. That allows that escape path off towards the north. So this is Tuesday. Already started to see that turn to the north. And there's that center there of Erin on Wednesday and into Thursday. And again, this is the European model. So this is the latest one that shifted just a little bit towards the west, still keeping that center offshore and eventually moving off towards the northeast. Again, all because this ridge is a little bit weaker. This one is a little bit stronger, and we have that cold front moving through that sort of breaks that ridge just a little bit, allowing Erin to lift off towards the north. So what are the impacts that we're going to feel? We talked about those large swells. Center of the hurricane could have 50-foot waves with it, and those waves will propagate towards the shoreline. But what about the winds? This is a product from the National Hurricane Center, and just started here with 40-mile-per-hour winds, tropical storm force winds. The odds that an area will see it, obviously around the center, 100% odds, which you can see here by the legend. And we are seeing, some of those gusty winds here through Puerto Rico over towards the Turks and Caicos. That's why we have those tropical storm watches up. But notice, this is the latest information from the Hurricane Center as of the 5 o'clock track. And notice, coastal North Carolina does have about a 10, maybe even a 20% chance down towards Cape Hatteras of seeing tropical storm force winds. Certainly the gusts could be stronger than that. And that's because of that little bit of that westward jog. And you can see some more solid 40-50% chance that they'll see it towards the island of Bermuda. Again, a little bit of a shift towards the west keeps the worst part of the storm still offshore, but it might bring the stronger, the tropical storm force winds and the odds a little bit higher through coastal Virginia and North Carolina. And I mentioned Cape Cod. Notice Cape Cod's up into that 10% chance as you move out there towards eastern Massachusetts. Might affect areas of Rhode Island a little bit as well. Main path offshore, but because the storm is going to be expanding, that wind field is going to be expanding, those winds will translate here westward. And again, coastal Virginia and North Carolina, maybe even through the Delmarva, New Jersey, and out towards the Cape, seeing that possibility of some tropical storm force winds. Now, 40-mile-per-hour winds sustained. Doesn't do too much damage. You get some higher gusts, and then you start to deal with that. But that prolonged wind coming in out of the northeast, you've got those big waves coming in. And as those waves are propagating in this direction towards the coastline, the winds are coming in 90-degree angle. That really creates more of a chop. That creates a high risk of rip currents. Again, we mentioned that I think red flags will be up and down the eastern seaboard as we go through the middle of next week. Wednesday into Thursday, passing closest to the Outer Banks of North Carolina, and then eventually off towards the north and east, and even parts of southern Maine could feel some of the gusty winds as we head towards the end of the week. Talk about the wave heights again. This is the latest run of the computer models here showing some of those strongest the waves here. Again, well offshore, but as we get there into those oranges and the reds, that's when we get 30, 35, 40, maybe even close to 50 foot waves around the center. This is based off of the European model. And again, those waves would translate towards the coastline and eventually off towards the north and northeast, and those waves will start to diminish. So the waves, certainly a concern. If you follow what happens along the Outer Banks, the Outer Banks are a narrow band of barrier islands that have shifted and reformed over centuries. Hurricanes have created inlets. They've moved the Outer Banks around a little bit. If you're familiar with the movie or the book, The Knights of Rodanthe, Rodanthe is a little community down here in Dare County, North Carolina, where recently we've seen numerous houses that have gone into the water. And you know, a lot of folks comment, well, why did they build so close to the water? Well, at the time, a lot of these homes were built, you know, in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. There was a lot more, you know, beach there. And as beach erosion and these barrier islands will shift around, some areas are losing sand, some areas are gaining sand, something that happens through many coastal areas where we have these barrier islands. But there are, you know, several houses that are in precipitous positions, and we get a little bit of overwash on Highway 12. We get some of that beach erosion, and that would be a concern anytime you have a passing tropical system or a nor'easter in the wintertime. So that's a concern through coastal North Carolina as well. And again, up and down the eastern seaboard, you know, a lot of schools have gone back. Maybe, you know, you got another week of summer vacation, so maybe some folks are heading out towards the Jersey Shore or any of the beaches up and down the eastern seaboard for this last week, maybe before school starts. Again, that's a concern, you know, because I think, again, red flags will be flying and we'll have that high risk of rip currents coming in. So again, this is the latest advisory from the Hurricane Center as of 8 o'clock. 150 mile per hour winds. We are seeing an Eyewall replacement cycle. Some fluctuations in strength are expected as the storm moves here off towards the west at 15 miles per hour. Again, some fluctuations. Doesn't make much difference whether it's 150 or 160 mile per hour storm. Effects are the same. Some slow weakening as the storm moves off towards the north. Again, that wind field will start to expand as the storm starts to weaken. It'll encounter some wind shear, start to transition a little bit, look a little bit different, but still a major hurricane, first hurricane of the year, first major hurricane of the 2020, this hurricane season as the storm moves off towards the north and northeast, the 2025 hurricane season. So again, major hurricane expected to stay off the East Coast. Still have to wait for that turn, which is expected as we get into Monday, but there has been a little bit of a shift, not much, but a little bit of a shift off towards the west. Again, this is the 8 o'clock advisory from the National Hurricane Center. And as I mentioned, just that advisory schedule, have full advisories, 5 a.m., 5 p.m., 11 a.m., 11 p.m. That's when we get the official forecast cone, watches, warnings, storm details, storm location. When a hurricane or a tropical system gets close to land, then we get those intermediate advisories. 5 a.m., 5 p.m., 11 a.m., 11 p.m. consistently, wherever the storm is. As the storm gets closer to land, we get updates every 3 hours, and sometimes you can get even other advisories every hour, every 2 hours, especially as the storm is getting close to making landfall. So this was the 8 p.m. advisory. We'll get a full advisory at 11 o'clock tonight, and then during the overnight, we'll get one at 2 a.m., another big advisory, the full advisory coming up at 5 a.m. So that's just, again, a look at that National Hurricane Center advisory schedule. I want to thank you for joining us here on this Saturday evening. Again, a lot to talk about with Hurricane Erin that is out there in the tropical Atlantic, seeing those heavy winds and the rain affecting areas of Puerto Rico. I'm 13 News Now meteorologist Evan Stewart at WVEC in Norfolk, Virginia. I want to thank all of you for joining us here on your station's Plus app on this Saturday evening. We'll do it again tomorrow night. Our chief meteorologist, Tim Pandagis, will be here Sunday evening at 8 o'clock, and through next week, we'll have Hurricane Hub Live. Be sure to check it out, and we'll let you know what is going on in the tropics. Again, meteorologist Evan Stewart, thanks for joining us on this Saturday evening.